What's up, Playground? It's me, Shanila, and welcome back to your Shadow Work series, where we're talking about the ins and outs of shadow work for 22 episodes. We made it all the way to episode 10, but don't worry if you missed any of the episodes, you can catch up and listen to how shadow work can support you in your healing journey. And if you're not already subscribed to the podcast, what are you doing? Go ahead and hit subscribe so you get a notification anytime there's a new episode coming out in the series. So the shadow work series has been really fun, but now we're getting into the 4 core wounds. That is basically the wounds that we all function from. And in the previous episode, I mentioned that there is a dominant wound, the wound that you default function from. And then there's also these other wounds that you're kind of sprinkled in as well. So last time we broke down the trust wound, and today we're talking about the abandonment wound. So as always, trigger warning, take some deep breaths, drink some tea as you're listening to this, and maybe take some notes for yourself as well. But as we're getting into the abandonment wound, this is a common one. I think, there's a percentage of how I believe these wounds are distributed. And I think this one's pretty high. This one's a dominant for many people. Now, the abandonment wound is a deep emotional wound that is caused from the experience of being physically, emotionally, mentally, psychologically left behind. It feels like people didn't care about you and they kind of left you there. So it stems from your childhood, your formative life, your formative moments in life where significant people and relationships made you feel unsupported or unworthy or discarded, right? So abandonment is not always like, oh, somebody like left you at the fire station when you were a baby in your little carrier. It could be that way, but it can also be this feeling of being discarded. So this wound shapes the way that you're approaching your present relationships as an adult. It impacts your self-worth because imagine feeling discarded, like that's going to make you feel some type of way. And then it also impacts your capacity to connect and really trust other people as well. So some of that trust issues from our previous episodes kind of sprinkled in here as well. So just like anything else, abandonment is not like a made up thing, right? There is some cause or something that happened in your past that made you have this. So this is, I want to point it out that sometimes, we do have made up problems and self-created problems, but most of our issues come from a deep core wound. And the way that this abandonment wound can be caused is by absence. So physical absence, right? Like when parents or caregivers aren't there, and it's not necessarily from malicious intent. I always want to point this out. It's not like a parent or a caregiver is like maliciously like not wanting to be there. It could be through divorce. It could be through death. It could be through separation. It could be through the capacity your parent or caregiver had in your upbringing, whether it's because they were working so hard or they were dealing with substance issues, or they had some other kind of obstacle or challenges that was taking place in their life where they were not really physically present for you. Now, that's the physical, but then that also leads to the emotional, right? Sometimes you don't really have the emotional support that you needed or wanted. And as a child, you didn't know that that's what you needed or wanted. You were a child, right? But it's the idea that perhaps you were not really feeling seen or supported. Even if the parent is like physically there, perhaps there's emotional absence. There's emotional neglect in that way. And I do want you to take some deep breaths as you're hearing this, because sometimes these words, it's like, well, I don't want to say like my mom neglected me because I don't feel neglected, or I don't want to say like my dad did this like, abusive thing. It's like, sometimes it's not as obvious to see that if you didn't have your emotional needs met, that can also translate as being unseen or unpresent, even if they were physically there. So kind of, dealing with the language as we're having this conversation too, because you might kind of dissociate to say like, no, I love my parents. I love this. It has nothing to do with love, right? Like the love doesn't necessarily translate to the needs that you may have had as a child that perhaps were not met in all the ways that they could have been. So another cause of the abandonment wound is rejection or betrayal, like feeling like, the people and caregivers or the circumstances and the environments that you were seeking connection in, you were being rejected. So like the family members, perhaps like you were the black sheep, or your family was the black sheep, so your grandparents kind of rejected you, or your cousins and your uncles kind of rejected your entire side of the family. And I'm projecting here, but there might be something like that where you felt like othered, right? Like you just knew that you weren't in this like sense of belonging. So there's this part of you that feels like, hey, like I'm not really understanding why I'm being rejected. Like what about me is so different? So you start to create these narratives of like, oh, it's because I do, because I'm from a single mother household, or because I do art, or I play sports, or you're trying to kind of categorize yourself. Your brain kind of wants to have this clean cut answer of like, oh, they don't like me because of fill in the blank. Whether that's not true, whether that's true or not true, that's not the point. Is to say that these are the narratives that get created when you're experiencing this sense of abandonment. Now, inconsistency, we brought this up when we talked about the trust wound as well, is that the abandonment can get more dramatized and more amplified when there's inconsistency. Inconsistency any kind of way, where your caregivers are inconsistent, your parents are inconsistent. There's inconsistency in trust, inconsistency, emotional and mental, physical, spiritual, financial, right? Like there's any type of inconsistency that is in the air. So if you're growing up in a space that is unreliable, or you feel like there's unavailable caregivers, even if you figure out the way to figure it out, and you figure out the way to survive, and you figure out the tools, and maybe there's some positives that come from being able to figure out your things yourself. You build some resiliency, you feel some self-reliable tools for yourself, you develop some problem solving skills. All of the things are the positives, but at the same time there might be some negatives and some consequences from having nobody to rely on, nobody who can teach you something, nobody who's like guiding you, nobody who is, really supporting you or mentoring you, and you're kind of seeking it outside of yourself. So abandonment wound, and I briefly kind of glossed over this, which is, there's things that we can control and there's things that we can't control, which is death, right? So death is a huge part. If there's like a traumatic ending that comes where, somebody passes away, whether you were expecting it or not, right? That doesn't change the fact that the death has an impact on the way that you feel like there's a gap or a missing part of you that is trying to make sense of the life right now. So, it could be a death in like a actual way where somebody like literally passes away, but death I mentioned in terms of divorce or separation. So if there's parents where parents separated, and now this family, your father lives over there, your mother lives over there, and you're kind of like going back and forth, or you're not going back and forth, you're only in one place and you're not getting the other parent when they're alive and well, but you don't have access to them. There's this abandonment issue that kind of starts to percolate within yourself. So losing someone or something in a way that is unexpected obviously adds to this abandonment issue. Now, let me talk to you about the way that it can manifest for you in your adult life. And we're talking about these shadows of we're talking about the abandonment wound, but the abandonment wound has the shadow of rejection. It has the shadow of abandonment. It has the shadow of invisibility. And it also has the shadow of emotional unavailability. Okay, I'm going to talk to you a little bit. Put a pin on this. I'm getting ahead of myself here. Put a pin on the emotional unavailability, but we're going to circle back there. But what was I saying? I was saying this is how it manifests in adults, the abandonment wound. It's this fear of rejection. So perfectionism. I'm talking to you, perfectionists. I'm talking about the people pleaser. I'm talking about the overthinkers, the self-doubter. You're just so afraid to be rejected, right? It's this constant anxiety that people are going to leave you or going to stop loving you. And you're even seeking that from strangers who don't even know you yet, And so like you can translate that into sharing your art and sharing your work in social media, or creating something and putting it out there to be perceived. There's a part of that. It's like, I am terrified to be perceived. I am terrified to do my best and still not being loved, or still not being picked, or still not being wanted, or still not being appreciated. And some of it is like, okay, some of it, there might be some reality in it. There is like a fear of like putting it out, and like, dealing with rejection is a true thing. But then it's like, you're not gonna try anything because this constant fear of rejection makes you so afraid that you don't do anything. You don't even create bad art. You don't create you don't even practice being a beginner because this fear of rejection is so much rooted in this abandonment. So you're also might be in this people pleasing era. This abandonment also makes you feel people pleasing, or you have this like clingy behavior where you're clinging to the wrong people in the wrong situation and the wrong circumstances because it's like you don't want people to leave you. You would rather be in interactions that are borderline abusive, and abusive is not always like somebody physically abusing you. Sometimes it is the emotional abuse. People being inconsiderate towards you and you put up with it because it's like, well, I would rather put up with this misbehavior than be by myself. I'm going to feel abandoned if, I don't have friends to hang out with who are abusive, right? So you can't really see them for the interaction that you're actually having because you're sending it through the lens of your wound. Now, this can also make you emotionally unavailable. And I said earlier, right? Like, let's put a pin on this because I wanted to like really break down this emotional unavailability. And perhaps you start to look at it from your own emotional unavailability or how it is that you're interacting with other people who are emotionally unavailable to you. And this is so common in relationships. Okay, where you're very available and you're working on your own shit. You're doing your inner child work. You're doing your shadow work. You're doing all the things that you're not perfect. Nobody is, but you're being mindful and intentional about dealing with your shit. Okay, but you're interacting with somebody who's constantly dealing with their own abandonment wound. So emotional unavailability can look like withholding emotions or shutting people out as a defense mechanism. So you shut them out. You hurt them before they can hurt you. You shut them out because they don't have the possibility of hurting you. You tell them no before they have a possibility of rejecting you. So you avoid vulnerability. You avoid saying like, I'm sad or this hurt me. You're going to say instead, you can't hurt me. Like nothing, I don't care about you enough for you to hurt me, right? Like and there's this kind of like emotional armor. You're wearing this armor. So the vulnerability piece, it makes it really hard because you're abandoning yourself in the meantime. You're preventing yourself from having these beautiful interactions and relationships and love and just like the possibility of somebody fucking liking you and loving you just for the sake of you being you without any pretense, without it being transactional, without it having to have like any kind of hierarchy. You're really just like fucking it up for yourself. You're shielding yourself. And this unavailability is sneaky because you don't understand like your behavior, your shut out, your trigger, your emotional trigger. You don't understand that. You feel like you're advocating for yourself, or whoever it is that you might be experiencing this abandonment wound from. They feel like they're advocating for themselves. They're protecting themselves. And you're here also with your own shit, your own triggers and your own wounds too. And now you're at a standstill. So there has to be a decision that both parties have to make to say like, this is really triggering me. Simultaneously, this is triggering you. And instead of seeing each other as the villain and as the bad guy and as somebody who's maliciously, not caring about you or not thinking about you, how is it that we move forward from that? So you see how abandonment wound can really be self-abandonment. Because you're self-sabotaging, you're pushing people away, or you're ending relationships prematurely because you want to avoid being abandoned later. And honestly, this is where you're also in relationships with people longer than you need to be. And it has nothing to do with how much you love them. Love is a beautiful tool. It's a beautiful energy. It's a beautiful thing, but it does not discount the fact that you still might be in an abusive interaction where somebody's unwilling to look at their wounds and you're abandoning yourself in the meantime. You're abandoning this child within you that seeks to be protected. And there's a barrier, right? There's a limit to how much you can deal with and how much is appropriate. Like, are you just like dipping out as soon as something is uncomfortable? Or did you legitimately put in the time, the effort, the conversation, the communication, and still here you are abandoning yourself because you aren't looking after you? And love has nothing to do with it, right? And you'll know when that boundary gets crossed, when that fine line gets crossed. You might start to feel the self-sabotage. You're pushing and putting yourself into situations with people because there's a fear that, wow, I have to start over, or I'm going to lose this, or I'm not going to be able to repair this. I'm not going to be able to, take care of myself after this. So I'm going to stay in this longer. And because you fear being abandoned, why? Let's look at the reasons. We said, let me try to remember. We said, traumatic endings. We said inconsistency. We said rejection and betrayal. We said emotional absence, physical absence, all of those things add to why we stay. All of those things add to why we put up with it. So you're not wrong to put up with it, but the more awareness that you have around your own self-worth and whether or not you're in interaction with places that are not necessarily honoring the work that you've done so far. Take a breath. Take a deep breath. Yeah, good. So, abandonment, here's the truth of it, is that it can actually make you feel really lonely in relationships because you might not be in the right ones. Understand? Like even when you're surrounded by the people, and I keep redefining for you the relationship. It's not just romantic. It's in any kind of interaction that you're in. It's like you still feel alone. You feel isolated, even when you're surrounded by other people. Because they're not truly able to see you for who you are. You're kind of putting on this mask, this persona, this like version of you that you think is acceptable for them, that is palatable for them. And they're not evil. Like they're not bad. They're not making you do anything. You have agency, choice, and autonomy to do that if you want to. Or you could decide to heal your abandonment wound and like make a conscious decision not to, right? And that's also a scary activity. So this makes you feel very scared to be alone, right? Like you're experiencing overwhelm or discomfort and perhaps even anxiety and solitude. Solitude and loneliness not being the same thing. Like the solitude is like that peacefulness that you have when you're by yourself. It's not like, oh, I'm isolating because like, oh, there's nobody out here who gets me, or nobody to love, or nobody loves me, or nobody, I'm not worthy, or everyone sucks, or it's not that narrative. It's just to say that like, it's actually safer for me to not bother than to put myself out there. And instead, when I do put myself out there, I'm going to put myself out there in the wrong situations and wrong circumstances where I'm not really being honored for the growth that I've done and the progress that I've made, the character development that I've had. So this is how it's manifesting. Now, perhaps you relate to all of that. You know what I mean? Perhaps you are dealing with the shadow of the rejection, pushing people away before they have a chance to, the shadow of the abandonment. So, you're having a little people-pleasing, clinging, codependent relationships here. You have the shadow of invisibility, so hold on, I want to talk about that. And I feel like this feels personal to me because many of my friends have this part of that, or I've watched them heal through this part of that, which is like really, really beautiful. The shadow of invisibility is like feeling like you are overlooked or you're unimportant. So you always kind of turn the conversation to other people. You ask about other people. You listen to other people. You hear people out. You're really able to see and show up for other people. But the second that attention gets turned to you, there's like a panic in your body, right? And there's like, oh, yeah, well, I don't feel like sharing, so you're a good listener and you're very present and you're very much interested and active in your presence with others. But the second somebody is present with you, there's like this panic energy in your body that says, it's not important. Like, I don't really need to share this, or this is not important. but the connection within people happens in these unimportant moments, right? It's not always like these big, profound things that you're talking about. It's sometimes the mundane stuff that builds that safety within each other. Like to be able to talk about something that is just silly and goofy and, like really mundane, or just like a basic human problem that you had today doesn't have to be this like huge creative thing that's always being talked about. That's the way that you develop safety within each other. Those friends that you can hang out with and you're just not like having to like be showy or dewy or like show off in any kind of way. You're just kicking it. You're just chilling. You're doing boring shit, and that's so beautiful. And I don't mean like dissociating together to the point where like you never, get out of that dissociation, but like healthy dissociation, like healthy, like, hey, you're working on your thing, I'm working on my thing. And it's like, okay, cool. Like every now and then we look at each other and smile and like say something and then like go back to your own thing. Like there's some safety in that. So the shadow of invisibility is like believing that your needs don't matter. So you avoid your self-expression. You avoid being too much. You avoid really, sitting with being perceived, being seen, being received, And the reason that I slowed down and I said like, oh, this feels personal to me as I've experienced my own friends go through some of that, and like my own perception of how I show up in many of the work that I do in the healing arts as a mentor, as a facilitator, as a creative, and 100 different other hats and labels that I take on as I wish. There's that part where you think that if you shine too bright or shine too much, then you're putting yourself out there to be judged or to have the criticism come your direction. And because I don't want the criticism, and because I don't want the judgment, I don't want your fucking opinion, and because I don't want, right? Like you don't shine too bright. You don't do something that draws attention to you. Otherwise, like society or culture is going to cut your head off, or they're going to tell you where your place is. And the thing about shining is that you don't have to outshine anything or anyone. You can just like do your own shine, and then other people can also do their own shine, and then like you just shine together. You know what I mean? Like that's the healed version of this conversation. That's like the concept where it's like, why does anybody's shine need to be more or less? It's like we're just all lighting up the world when we shine just a little bit. And when you have this belief that it's too much, then you are kind of in competition with yourself. And in that competition with yourself, you abandon yourself. You self-sabotage the possibilities, because you're projecting what's going to happen if you are seen. They're going to judge you. They're going to say this. They're going to say, you're too much, you're too little, you're too blah, blah, blah. The judgment is over there. So perhaps that's something you relate to. So that was the shadow of invisibility. And now you also have the shadow of emotional unavailability, which we talked about. So I hope this conversation helps you out, and let me know what you resonated with. Go ahead and take a screenshot of this episode and tag me on Instagram at shanila.satar. Share it on your stories and let me know what it is that you took away from this episode. And if you're relating, is any of this triggering? And it's totally fine if it is. Shadow work is the parts of us that is like a little mucky and dark to go into. So if your body is, agitated in the conversation, that's totally fine to take deep breaths and move forward from that. So if you are interested to do shadow work with me for 6 weeks in the new year, go ahead and head to www.alwaysplay.org/shadow-work. We're going for 6 weeks and really getting into these big wounds that impact the way that we show up, especially for the artists and the creatives and the people who, want to be in their creative flow in whatever it is that you're doing and creating in life. Your shadow work is one of the critical moments in your healing journey that allows you to flow through your creative process rather than forcing your way through that. So if you're interested, I'll leave you a link in the show notes. And friends, just remember, the world is your playground. And until next time, I will catch you soon.